Thank you everybody for coming today to the final panel, the grand finale of our PSA Parliament's annual conference. My name is Stephen Bates. I'm one of the co-conveners of the specialist group, and we're very lucky today to have three brilliant speakers talking to us about the past, present and future of parliamentary and legislative studies. We've got Emma Crewe, who's Professor of Social Anthropology and Director of the Global Research Network for Parliaments and People at SOAS University of London. Emma has conducted ethnographies of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons and has just published her latest book, The Anthropology of Parliaments, with Taylor and Francis. We've also got Shane Martin, who holds the Anthony King Chair in Comparative Government at the University of Essex, where he is also head of the Department of Government. He's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Legislative Studies and has also published Parliaments and Government Formation with Oxford University Press. And our third speaker is Misha Taylor-Robinson, who's Professor of Political Science and Associate Head of the Department of Political Science at Texas A&M University. Misha is the co-editor of Legislative Studies Quarterly and has published 2 books with Oxford University Press, Women in Presidential Cabinets and Representation, the Case of Women. Before we move on to the roundtable, Caroline Bhattacharya, who's a member of the PSA Parliament Specialist Group, is going to present the findings of the survey and some bibliometric analysis that we've done of parliamentary studies scholarship. Caroline is not only a member of the PSA Parliament's team, but is also a PhD student at the University of Helsinki, researching party unity in the German Bundestag, which she's published in Politics and Governance and Parliamentary Affairs. So Caroline is going to talk for about 12 minutes, and then we'll move on to the roundtable, where the speakers will be talking in alphabetical order, and then we'll have about an hour for general discussion. So, Caroline, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's my great pleasure to present these findings today, and on behalf of the entire PSA Parliament's team. And we would like to thank the School of Government at the University of Birmingham and the Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool for providing funding for this little project. I'm going to jump straight into the findings. I'm going to start with the survey, which we ran for 3 months and it closed only a few days ago. So I'm going to talk about some initial findings today. We received 218 responses from parliamentary and legislative researchers working in 48 countries across all world regions. As we are a UK-based organization, we reached a lot of UK-based scholars, but we have a fairly wide geographical coverage. And the second largest group is from the United States. I'm not going to show you the statistics, so you have to take my word for it, but also in terms of, for example, age and career stages, we have a rather even distribution. The mean age of the respondents is 43 years. 37% of respondents self-describe as a woman. 12.4% belong to an ethnic minority in their country of work. For the UK, this number is 14.1%, and also 14.1% overall have an ethnic minority background in either or both their country of birth and country of work. 1 in 10 self-identify as asexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, or queer. 7.1% say that they have a disability. If we use country of birth, country of highest degree, and country of current work as an estimate of international mobility, we find that 5.3% are highly mobile, 30.1% have a medium mobility, and 64.6% a low mobility. And women seem to be more mobile. Let's take a look at the most popular research areas next. At least 1/3 of parliamentary scholars investigate representation, the relations between parliaments or legislatures and the executive, committees, the role of political parties, policy making, and roles and careers in parliaments and legislatures. Among the top 10 research interests are also lawmaking, procedures and rules, and scrutiny. And every 5th researcher also studies gender. Less than 1 in 5 use exclusively qualitative or quantitative methods in their research on parliaments, which maybe suggests that the presumed camps that we so often hear about are not really as divided as we might think. Overall, there are more researchers who use exclusively or mostly qualitative methods, and 15.7% use qualitative and quantitative methods equally. So what are the most popular methods? More than 70% of respondents have conducted at least one case study. And when we look more closely at the approaches, we can identify 3 categories of popular approaches. The first one is interviews. Semi-structured interviews are more often used than unstructured, as well as surveys, questionnaires, and participant observation. So these are methods which aim to directly hear from or observe parliamentary actors. The second group includes methods like archival research, content analysis, documentary analysis, and discourse analysis. So methods to study texts and other parliamentary documents. And then thirdly, we have statistical methods such as regression analysis and multivariate statistics. Let me conclude this section with some views the respondents expressed on the state of the subdiscipline. And first, we asked them to tell us what they think about the statement that female academics are underrepresented in parliamentary studies. And more than half of respondents agreed with this. And this is a view that is more pronounced among female researchers and researchers belonging to an ethnic minority, while, for example, early career researchers feel somewhat more neutral about this question. Next, we ask about the representation of academics from ethnic minority backgrounds in parliamentary and legislative studies. And in addition to ethnic minority researchers themselves, more than 80% of researchers based in the UK and female respondents say that ethnic minority scholars are not sufficiently represented in the subdiscipline, and half of them strongly think so. This is the last finding from the survey for now, so we also asked some questions about research diversity and pluralism. There is a broad consensus that the subdiscipline would benefit from more plurality in terms of case selection. 78.4% agree or strongly agree with this view. And 64.7% believe that more academic diversity would also be beneficial in terms of theoretical perspectives. And for early career researchers, this share is actually even higher. Also, close to 80% of early career parliamentary researchers think that we need a more diverse range of methods and techniques compared to 64% overall. We also conducted analysis of the last 25 years of publications in Parliament journals. So from the Scopus database, we downloaded the bibliographic information of all articles that have been published in Parliamentary Affairs, the Journal of Legislative Studies, and Legislative Studies Quarterly between 1996 and spring this year. After some cleaning of the data, our data set comprises of 2,415 articles written by 2,353 authors. Scopus does not provide any information on the gender of authors, so we assigned the gender based on personally knowing the author, their name, or by looking for cues on their online profiles. And we do know that this is not a perfect approach and has some ethical implications, which is why, of course, we got ethical approval for this, and that there is a chance that we misgendered a small proportion of authors, but we are taking this into account and will try to rectify this the best we can. So overall, our data set includes 27.9% female authors, and the main objectives of this part of the study are to identify publication and citation trends, and to map the subdiscipline in terms of co-authorship networks, citation networks, which is something we are still working on, and topics. Let's start with an overview of the authors with most publications in our data set. There are 31 authors with 8 or more articles, This list is topped by Philip Norton with 27 and Christina Liston-Bandera with 17. The list includes 3 women, and the majority of these scholars here in the list are from the US or the UK. Mirroring some broader developments in the social sciences, we find a declining trend in single author publications and a rise in the average number of authors, which between 2004 and 2019 has increased from 1.39 to 2. The average number of authors is significantly higher in the US-based journal Legislative Studies Quarterly than in the other 2 journals, and every 5th article in Legislative Studies Quarterly has 3 or more authors compared to every 10th in the other 2 journals. The next question we were interested in is who co-authors with whom. So this is a co-authorship network, and I want to highlight that this is only for the journal articles included in our dataset. But I do think it gives us an overview of co-authorship communities. I do not have the time to talk you through all the technicalities, but I'm happy to answer any questions about this, of course. But basically what we did is we ran a clustering analysis to help us identify and visualize co-authorship communities. So the different colors you see are the different clusters. In total, we found 52 groups. And as you see, there are 6 groups which form a larger subnetwork, which includes, for example, Christina Liston-Bandera, Philip Norton, Charles Petty, Ron Johnston, Paul Whiteley, and many, many others. These groups reflect, of course, geographical proximity. So there are clearly some UK-based, some US-based, and some Central Western European clusters, for example. But we also see groups of researchers with common research interests or theoretical standpoints, for example, rational choice theory or feminist theory. There are 13 larger groups with at least 5 authors, and 2 of these groups have an equal number or higher number of female authors, and 2 of them are all male groups. And there are also 3 groups with 10 or more authors, which include only 1 woman. So let's talk a bit more about gender. So 23.9% of the articles in our dataset have been written by a female single author or first author. If you remember, this is lower than the overall percentage of female authors, which is 27.9%. Again, there are some differences between the 3 journals. So Parliamentary Affairs has the highest share and Legislative Studies Quarterly the lowest share. The good news is that the average number of citations does not really differ. So it is 13.51 for women and 13.49 for men. Over time, we do see a rise in female authorship. It is a non-steady increase, and it is less pronounced in Legislative Studies Quarterly. In terms of geographical affiliation, 69.1% of articles were written by single and first authors based in the UK or US. However, as the figure on the right illustrates, this is a declining trend, and parliamentary and legislative studies is actually becoming more international. You're probably not surprised to see that the US-based Legislative Studies Quarterly features mainly US-based scholars, and Parliamentary Affairs, which is run by the Hansard Society, has mostly UK-based authors. For the Journal of Legislative Studies, more than half of the publications are by authors from other countries. We also wanted to know what are the key topics that parliamentary and legislative researchers are interested in, but only 28.4% of the publications in our dataset have keywords, but 82.6% have an abstract, and of course, all of them have a title. So instead of using the keywords to analyze topics, we applied a text mining technique to the titles and abstracts. So after some cleaning and grouping of very similar terms, we then generated a co-occurrence network. So we included terms that appeared in at least 10 publications, and then we picked the most relevant ones. The cluster analysis revealed 5 clusters, so groups of terms that tend to co-occur. Maybe we could call these megatopics. So let's take a look what this network looks like. It might be a bit difficult to see, but I'm going to quickly talk you through this. So the biggest cluster is the red one. And this one seems to revolve mainly around both chambers of the UK Parliament, devolution, the British government, parliamentary engagement and communication, as well as political participation. This is complemented by the yellow cluster, which deals mainly with elections and the political parties in Great Britain, you see that the biggest nodes in this cluster are general election, campaign, labor, and conservative. The second largest cluster is the blue one, which relates primarily to US legislative politics and institutions, voters, candidates, different aspects of legislative behavior, party leadership, as well as party loyalty and discipline. Topics and parliaments to do with Latin America also appear to be more closely related to the US literature. And then we have the green cluster of topics about the European Union and European integration, European parliamentary systems, party systems, committee systems, and executive legislative relations. And the purple cluster reflects the literature on women, ethnic minorities, and different concepts of representation. So let me conclude by just saying that in light of other recent studies and reports on diversity and representation in political science, the findings from the survey and the publication analysis seem to suggest that our subdiscipline is not doing worse than the wider discipline, but probably not much better either. The vast majority of our findings, for example, about the dominance of Europe and Northern America and gender patterns, are probably not really surprising to you, but rather confirm some of your own personal observations and experiences. But gathering some empirical evidence and having an overview like this hopefully encourages more dialogue between researchers from different countries and backgrounds, and between scholars using different theoretical and methodological approaches to study similar topics. And I think today is a good opportunity for widening and deepening that conversation. So I'm going to stop here, and we are all waiting to hear from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. So we'll move straight along to the roundtable and to Emma. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you to Stephen and colleagues for inviting me to speak. I'm really, really delighted to try and say something about what I think Caroline started as a form of ethnography of parliamentary scholars. So actually seeing a little preview of your work made me think, actually, we need not just to think about the outputs that come out of parliamentary scholarship, but the scholars themselves. Actually, let's understand who we are. So I think what you've done, Caroline, is really, and colleagues, really, really valuable. And I want to carry on in that vein. So who are the people who are parliamentary scholars? Well, I suppose mostly in terms of discipline, we are in political science, history and law departments, teachers, researchers, writers. But of course, there are others who study Parliament. There are parliamentary monitoring organisations, there are research institutes, journalists, of course, you could say, are part of the study of Parliament, even politicians themselves. And then there are all these networks like the PSA network, the Study of Parliament group, and many others, the International Parliamentary Engagement Network. So we might need to really understand the networks that we form to do a proper ethnography of parliamentary scholars. So we're a community, and I think what you've done in a very valuable way is point to some of the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. And one of the mechanisms that I'm interested in is the fact that there are loads of scholars in the global south who are teaching about parliaments, but we don't necessarily hear from them. They're not necessarily getting into the journals. So how can we interact with them a bit more? But I want to talk mostly today about a shift in disciplinary focus. So I'm going to show you some slides now. So I want to talk about a disciplinary shift that's been, I think, observable in recent years. So if I begin with Dennis Sen-Martin, who wrote in a handbook in 2020 that there are 4 main approaches to the study of Parliament. He was talking about parliamentary ethics, but I think we can broaden it to other processes. And he was pointing to the fact that most theories fall under the category of either functionalism or rational choice theory or institutional sociology, or what he calls, interestingly, social embeddedness. And I think social embeddedness nicely encapsulates both anthropology and ethnography, and I'll come to the distinction between the two in a short while. So I placed myself firmly within this social embeddedness category. And what's interesting for me is that I felt extremely marginal when I started about 20 years ago. But I'm feeling much more sort of a part of the community of parliamentary scholars, partly reassured by you inviting me to speak today. So this is partly why I'm really, really delighted, because I feel very much more part of the community. Now, how has this happened? I would love to claim some credit, but I don't think it's really got anything to do with me. I think it actually goes right back to the breathtakingly innovative study that Richard Fenno did all those years ago, which has taken a long time to kind of percolate. But also these four here, I think have had a big influence on enabling a kind of more open-minded approach to different disciplines, but also different methodologies for studying parliaments. And I haven't got time to talk about them all, but I'm interested in Philip Norton, because for me, he's probably the most participant observing researcher as a parliamentarian himself. There are others around the world, but he's obviously extremely prolific and well known. So I think his situation is interesting. I think he's had a very big influence on making it more possible for other ethnographers to pioneer new ways of doing parliamentary studies. So I think we have seen a shift. So it's interesting to note that the handbook, which came out in 2014, has been added to by one which only came out last year, and actually puts interdisciplinary approaches right in the up front there. So I think that is indicative of a shift towards a greater interest in inter or even multidisciplinary studies. And I want to draw attention to some of the authors' point in the handbook on the left, which is edited by one of my co-panelists, Shane Martin. So one of the things I found interesting is that some of the authors in that handbook said that there is a problem with these socially embedded approaches or micro-political or in-depth studies because they can't generalize and they can't find causal links. I found this incredibly useful. This provocation was really what led me to write this book. So I'm very grateful to you, Shane, for sort of inspiring me, although I'm not even sure that it was you who made these comments. But certainly it was your authors within the handbook, some of your authors, because I think it is a really fair challenge. How can these in-depth studies by anthropologists and other ethnographers make claims to generalize? So I think the first thing I tried to do in this book, which just came out last month, was distinguish between anthropology, ethnography, and participant observation. So for me, anthropology is a discipline which is rather like a very kind of practically oriented form of philosophy. We ask a lot of the same questions as philosophers. As Tim Ingold put it, it's like philosophy, but the people are still in it. So we never stay at a totally abstract level. We always come down to earth and look at what real people do, the ways in which they act as individuals, but also the way they act as collectives, the way they're constrained by rules, the way they contest ideologies, the relationships they create with each other, and the everyday practices which keep reforming cultures. So that's kind of the discipline, and we go anywhere. We look at economic systems, we go into political worlds, we're interested in kinship. We're insanely ambitious because we want to try and understand any and all aspects of social worlds. The approach we take to finding out things is what we describe as ethnography, but we have a particular way of doing it. So I think one of the things that would be really interesting to explore is the way anthropologists do ethnography as opposed to other disciplines. But in short, and please ask me about this if you're interested, I think we always have a commitment to reflexivity. We pay attention to plurality and the different views and practices that different groups of people engage in. And we have to have a sensibility for other disciplines, because we're always in conversation. As a small discipline, we're always in conversation with other disciplines wherever we go. So we have to try and understand the assumptions and the forms of rigor that are created by the disciplines that we're in conversation with. And finally, what method do we use? Well, we'd like to be, if we're studying politicians, except that we're most of us not brave enough. I'm certainly not, so I'm not going to be a politician. So we have to find other ways to do what we call participant observation. It's abductive in the pragmatist American philosophers' form of thinking of inquiries, rather than inductive or deductive. So that's something about the difference between anthropology, ethnography, and the methods we use. But I still feel I need to say more about how we do it. So I think what's really important about anthropology and the way that we do ethnography is that we're always doing a mixture of involvement and detachment, as the sociologist Norbert Elias put it. So sometimes we get up really close. Tim Ingold described us as being like hunters, or I sometimes think we're like detectives, but hopefully there's no murder being committed, using whatever method is necessary, getting up close, and very often in an embodied sense, being present, being engaged in the sense of actually taking our bodies and putting them as close as we can to the action to really find out what's going on. But we also have to get detached at times, because you can't always see the patterns if you're too close to particular groups. You need to get a bit of detachment to see the overall patterns that are being created, for example, by different political parties. So there's a sense in which you have to be up close at times and further away at times. So you have to have a kind of sense of appropriate distance from your subjects. And what do you come up with as anthropologists is always messy. If you're really interested in the differences between people, and in political world, there are always highly contested views about what's going on, then you have to find a way to make sense out of the mess. And I see politicians, as I'm sorry to those of you who've heard me talk about this before, but I see the work of politicians as highly improvised. The effective politicians are shape-shifting continually from one form of work to another, from one audience to another. So what continuities can we find? And surveying all the work of anthropologists that has been done really since Weatherford, around the same time as Fenno did a study of the Congress, and then Marc Abilés, some years later, studied the French Assembly. And since then, there have been actually quite a few anthropologists, more in Europe than in any other region. What have they found? Well, the forms of continuity that they've particularly dwelt on are various, but just to zone in on two. The most obvious one is the ideologies that are contested within parliaments. I call them rifts of meaning, to kind of convey the sense that they're endlessly improvised for other audiences, rather like jazz musicians have a little nugget, a little kind of musical harmony, which they replay in different lengths and with different variations, and they perform differently for different audiences. And this process pulls politicians in lots of conflicting directions. Even more interesting, I think, are the rhythms of work that politicians engage in as individuals, but also as collectives, as little groups who are interested in the same cause. Obviously, political parties are a form of grouping. So what are the rhythms in the sense of the ways in which routines are created by politicians that are repetitive, but also varying, both in Parliament, but also in districts or constituencies? What are these rhythms, and how do they change from day to day, week to week, and during the seasonal sort of political periods? And what's interesting, I think, is to look at why there are variations, because it's how we can systematically study why change happens. So, for example, let me just tell you the story of Willy Brandt, who I'm sure you've probably heard this story before, but I do think it's a fantastic example of how from one story you can find a significance from which you can generalize. Willy Brandt was, he wrote later in his memoir, standing there ready to do the normal thing when you're at a monument and you're laying a wreath. And in this case, it was to commemorate the Holocaust. And he was overcome by an emotion of inadequacy. He thought the normal routine is just not enough. And in that moment, he knelt. And he changed the way in which Germans thought about the Holocaust forevermore. Because in that moment, he symbolized the act of asking for forgiveness. He took responsibility much more explicitly on behalf of the German nation in that moment. In a sense, you could probably say it's a fantastic example of the kind of butterfly effect. That tiny gesture rippled and changed the world. And that you can generalize about that process. Obviously, that exact moment, that instance will never happen again, but you can generalize from these powerful narratives. So finally, last slide, finally, just to say that there's much that we haven't studied, including as anthropologists. I've just mentioned emotions, for example, the way that emotions are entangled with politics, the impact of digital media, but also going back to Fenno, I don't think we have finished the job of really understanding how politicians relate to others in society, including their own constituents. So that's why we've started a new project, Christina Lessambanriara and I coordinating a project in 6 countries across the world. And we're going to try and do this in a really decolonizing kind of way. We aspire certainly to work a bit differently, and we're focusing particularly on the ruptures in relationships between politicians and people. So we'd love to come back and tell you more about that in a few years' time. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emma. That was brilliant. We'll move straight on to Shane.
Great, thank you, Stephen. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's rather scary to be in the midst of such distinguished colleagues. So the past, the present, and the future. Just some relatively random thoughts, I have to say. So the past. For me, primarily legislative studies or parliamentary studies, and of course there's a lot of politics in terms of which term is used, was very much individuals studying individual parliaments, as it were. I often like to refer to a golden age of legislative studies or parliamentary studies, particularly in the United States, focused primarily, of course, on committees and legislative organization. And why was it a golden age? I think it was a golden age partly because it very much, parliamentary studies very much dominated the discipline, as it were. It was highly reductionist. It was very abstract. It was highly conflictual. You had those sort of great debates, often personalized between people like Cox and McCubbins, Shepstein, Weingast, Kribel. Highly personal, highly cleavage-based, as it were. But actually, you know, was it a golden age? It wasn't a particular golden age if we think, what did we learn that we didn't know about legislatures and parliaments before then? So, you know, in terms of the dominance of the discipline, the past was very much healthier than the present in many ways. So moving to the present very, very briefly, and you know, Caroline and the work that the PSA has done on this and the bibliometrics is really interesting. And you know, I can't really add to it except to sort of add my own personal observations, which very much aligns with the data presented today. So congratulations on that project, and it's very interesting. So what do I think has changed in the present compared to the past? I think the first and most obvious one, of course, is more co-authorship, which is something I think in general to be welcomed. I mean, single-authored work is still highly valued in some countries, in some parts of the discipline, of the academic discipline at least. But actually, there's much more of a move towards a science-based model in terms of co-authorship. There's more comparative work, arguably. And actually here you sort of get synergies and the ability to apply the comparative method, either over time or actually across countries, I think is quite interesting. I think there's still a sort of like this is quite colonial of me, and I say that as an Irish person, whose ancestors at least was part of a colony. There's still very much a bifurcation, but a bifurcation based on the global north, as it were, for want of a better term. So we used to, for many of us when we were in graduate school, we learned that there were two ways to do political science, and people like Emma, thankfully, come along and tell us, actually, don't be so silly. There are many more ways, and we may speak a different language, but actually our goals and our ambitions are often the same, and the conclusions of our work and our findings are often the same. But of course, historically, at least, I talked of in an article long time ago in PS, APSA's professional journal, two houses, as it were, two particularly different styles of doing parliamentary studies. One which I described as a European tradition, sort of more of a thick descriptive work, and more of a US deductive quantitative approach. And I think the reality is that article has not withstood the test of time. Thankfully, the discipline is now far more varied. There are far more interesting methods, and people are applying their particular paradigmatic perspectives to different locations. But there is, I think, as we saw from Caroline's presentation today, there is still a heavy focus on a small number of parliaments, and that's something that's not to be applauded, as it were, as interesting as specific cases are. I should say, of course, for everybody on the call, I'm a scholar of Irish politics, and I sometimes say to colleagues, I have a particular challenge there, because in Ireland, nobody cares about Parliament because people don't think it's particularly important as part of the political system. And comparatively, nobody cares about the Irish case. So I find myself constantly struggling to frame my research to try to appeal to the disciplinary expectations of publishing in high quality journals, for want of a better term. So, but anyway, continuing my sort of my journey into the present, right? So what has changed in recent years, I think? Well, Emma pointed very nicely and framed it very beautifully, I have to say, to the handbook. And when we wrote the handbook, of course, we talked about the sort of a lot of deductive approaches and big ideas, et cetera, but it was very much at the beginning of, and we largely missed, although did not exclusively miss, the identification revolution, as it were, the causal identification revolution. The idea that if you simply do regression analysis on observational data, you can't actually make claims that are based on A causing B, for example. And so, that has been a revolution in the discipline. And in many ways, where the discipline of political science, I'm speaking primarily of political science, where the discipline goes, legislative studies often has to follow. That's just a normal part of the fact that the majority of people who do parliamentary studies are in politics departments, as it were. The other thing, of course, which is very interesting, is the rise of data science. So my own vice chancellor, for example, refuses to call himself a political scientist. He says he's a scholar of politics. He's a professor of politics, but actually he's one of the greatest proponents of data science. Which I always find quite ironic, I have to say. So, the increasing role of big data and data science. And it's perhaps most clear and most evident in parliamentary studies with this move to using text as data. So taking a parliamentary record and quantifying it, much to the dislike of lots of people, of course, in the discipline. And I'm one of those text as data people in a very non-methodologically sophisticated way myself, looking at the content of parliamentary questions. But it is interesting when you pick up the top 3 journals in the profession. So talking about the general journals, if there is an article on parliamentary studies today, it is most likely to be about text as data, or at least employ some very sophisticated text as data technique. I sort of, I have mixed feelings about this. It's always great to see parliamentary studies in the general journals. But the question I always pose to people who do text as data analysis of the parliamentary record is, well, when a parliamentarian speaks, fair enough, there's some cost to speaking, so there must be some benefit to speaking. But who's actually listening to parliamentarians when they speak? because sometimes the emphasis on this text as data implies that it's a lot more people than is in reality the case. Anyway, continuing my journey of the present of the discipline, one of the things I do want to point to is the fact that actually compared to a few years ago, the discipline and the subfield of parliamentary studies is much better organized. This is the case at APSA, for example, noting in particular recent work to try to enhance the status of women in legislative studies. It's a particular problem in the United States. It's good to see the comparative data presented by Caroline provides for not exactly a healthy situation by any metric, but much better than many of us would have thought. There's the ECPR, of course, standing group, and there's the PSA, and you know, I will use the opportunity to compliment the group, the PSA Parliament group, on not just this, but actually being a very active society, and that sort of organizational basis is exceptionally important, I think, to a strong subfield. For me, looking at the current discipline, it's notably male and pale. And as I said earlier, too focused on too few countries. Not that I'm sort of making a call for everybody to start studying the Irish Parliament, as nice as that would be. Right, very briefly, to the future. So I've been waiting for the identification revolution to go away so I can continue with my observational studies. I don't think, in fairness, that's happening. I had one survey experiment of Irish parliamentarians published. And I really do wish that we would stop our focus on thinking that as social scientists we can actually make causal or valid causal arguments. This raises, of course, the ethics of how to do parliamentary studies when we actually have to involve parliamentarians, and in particularly the ethics of people who are trying to do causally identified studies. And some people, particularly in the United Kingdom, will have seen some recent media attention to the use of British MPs as survey respondents, as it were, and the ethics of providing them with information that is not necessarily accurate to try to get this causally identified piece of research, as it were. I think the really great thing about the identification revolution, however, is that it may, ironically, create more space for descriptive work. I really long for a day where I can sit down and write a paper where I can just describe what is happening, describe the world, rather than having to come up with some theory to explain the world, as it were. So, I mean, I would love to see in legislative studies and parliamentary studies more descriptive work, just describing. It can be a phenotype, soaking and poking, or it can be completely related to something else. But just a description of how parliaments work, how parliamentarians work, what they do, less why they do what they do, more what they do, I think would be, I'd love to see an emphasis on that. I don't think that's going to happen, of course, because I think the discipline is the political science discipline, at least, is focused still on theory and theory testing, and sort of, at least sort of after you've looked at your data, qualitative or quantitative, coming up with a theory to fit what actually you have observed, which I think is appalling behavior, but I think it probably is 90% of what scholars do these days. For me, I think the most interesting thing is I really like research that says something interesting, that challenges conventional wisdom. How it does it, what method it uses, what paradigm it uses, I really don't care. I just want to learn something new. And this is a test we apply to undergraduate dissertations. And sometimes I think we're really bad at actually applying it to our own discipline. I think obviously we need to increasingly link, and in Britain, this is partly reflecting the research excellence framework that we all live within. But actually, this is a trend I see in countries such as the United States also. There has to be some societal benefit. I know I sound like a Tory minister when I say this to research. Research for the sake of research is good. But actually, the degree to which we can link our research agendas to what it is people in society, whatever that means, care about. And obviously today it's the environment, it's equality, it's gender equality, it's race equality, etc. And the degree to which we can link our research agendas of the field to what it is society cares about, I think is very important. I think there's an increasing role for historical analysis. You know, why study 2019 when you can understand from a historical perspective that, you know, things don't change very much. Technology changes. Even, you know, pandemics come and go, but, you know, I think historical analysis in legislative studies is underestimated. I'd like to see more comparative work, even if it's reductionist, but more comparative work, absolutely. Sometimes when I compare legislative studies to a subfield like electoral systems, for example, I become very jealous, because what I notice is, you know, whenever you want to study anything in the world, why some countries are democracies, why some countries have greater inequality, why some countries are wealthier, there's always something, the authors will say, and we control for the electoral system. So the electoral studies people have been very good at sort of reducing to one variable the impact of electoral systems on anything in the world. And of course, for parliaments, we haven't gotten there yet, and perhaps we don't want to get there, but I think it's one noticeable difference between parliamentary studies and other subfields. You know, I mean, how do you reduce a legislature to one variable? The most popular way, particularly if you're a US-based scholar, is to claim that bicameralism defines what the role of a parliament in a political system. But I think many of us would find that quite wanting. But while also stressing the need for more comparative research, I think absolutely the gold standard, I've talked about the sort of golden era, but the gold standard for research needs to return to monographs. And we, you know, what journals will look like, what journal publications will look like in 5 years' time. Will there still be journals? I've no idea. Increasingly, I hope there won't be. What will replace journals is the big question. But obviously, I think the gold standard for research has to be a monograph, because it gives the space, it gives the depth, which is needed to actually move the field forward. And Emma's wonderful contribution is noteworthy in this regard, amongst many others. And finally, speaking of journals, assuming they're going to be around for a little while, and I'm conscious that we have a distinguished, in Misha, we have a distinguished journal editor here, so this is not meant as a criticism. I've been on the editorial board of Legislative Studies Quarterly for a few years. But I think in general, you know, it's great to see a healthier set of journals in the discipline than at any time previously. Parliamentary affairs has really come along a long way in recent years, and the past and the current editorial teams are to be congratulated on that. LSQ likewise is very much, you know, the journal to go to in the United States when you can't get into the top 3 general journals. But there's a fundamental problem with all of the legislative studies journals, and that's the impact factor of the journal. And I know impact factors are highly political things, but when it comes to tenure decisions, when it comes to promotion decisions, when it comes to hiring decisions at many universities, including my own, these things are important. And too much legislative studies research is being ignored by fellow legislative studies people and other parts of the discipline, and perhaps other disciplines. And that's not the fault of the other parts of the discipline. That I suggest to you, and I will leave with this comment, not wishing to end on a negative point. We really have to sell our research as legislative scholars, as parliamentary scholars, to other parts of the political science discipline, but also to other disciplines. And the way to do that, of course, I suggest, is to say something novel and say something interesting. And I wished I could apply that perspective to my own research agenda. I would be a much better scholar if I were. So I'm not trying to set a standard that I can't fully meet myself. It is simply my ambition and my goal. Stephen, I'll stop there if that's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane. And over to our final speaker, Misha.
Well, thank you so much to Stephen and your colleague, Stephen, for organizing this panel. And I'm really honored to be invited to take part. I feel very much like one of those legislative studies scholars, not a parliamentary studies scholar, and in particular, somebody whose research background is in Latin America. So I really feel honored to be invited. And so I'm going to talk briefly about past, present, and mostly about future. When I started in this field, and I wrote in the mid to late 1980s, which scared me really badly, study of legislatures was not a mainstream topic in Latin American politics, which was my regional area of interest. And part of the reason that it wasn't a mainstream topic was that most democracies in the region were new. The third wave of democracy got to Latin America around 1980, and only Costa Rica, Colombia, and Venezuela had a long history of democracy before that. But in addition, historically, legislatures were viewed as very weak actors. Power was focused in the executive, whether that executive was democratically elected or an authoritarian leader. And a lot of presidents used the legislative branch for democratic window dressing. Today, however, this has really changed. A lot of colleagues whose primary data collection comes from Latin America are very interested in legislatures and legislative executive relations, and basically do work that fits very nicely under the umbrella of what's listed on the Parliament's section webpage. Of course, also there was and still is the case of the US Congress in presidential studies, with its immense amount of scholarship digging into an incredibly large amount of overtime data. And theory based on the study of the US Congress has a strong influence on research about legislatures in other presidential systems. But I imagine, especially with this audience, you've noticed I haven't yet said anything about parliamentary systems. And that's because my assessment is that in the past, there was a really big gulf between parliamentary scholars and scholars studying legislatures in presidential systems. So moving on to the present, thankfully, I think there is a great deal more global view of legislative studies and more interaction of scholars across the globe. Obviously, this is a great example here today. As Emma mentioned, networks are getting broader. I would agree that they're not yet broad enough. And I think that comes into what I want to say about the future. I will say, as the LSQ co-editor for comparative politics, I have been gratified at the willingness of scholars who study European parliaments or the US Congress to be willing to review papers whose data come from Latin America or Asia or Africa and vice versa. And I think that's really good for us because it forces us as researchers to be thoughtful about the scope conditions of our theories and to utilize literature from beyond our region and to explore what may be moving parts in the theory that previously were constants. I also think the present, excuse me, time is exciting because of new sources of data that are allowing us to ask questions that we only could conjecture about in the past. So an example is the automated text analysis that Shane was talking about, and I totally agree. Is anybody listening to what members of parliament say? But I would argue if you're an MP or a backbench deputy and you want to build a political career, your party leader very well may be aware of what you're saying, particularly if you're making trouble. And so, for example, research looking at parliamentary questions in the case of the German mixed member system, or research looking at British members of parliament and those who are rebelling against their party versus those who are towing the party line. Another new source of data is looking at how MPs make use of social media. There's also a growing amount of work using experiments, for example, an experiment conducted in Malawi to look at what voters care about in MP candidates, or an experiment conducted, a conjoint experiment in Britain, Germany, and Austria, looking at how citizens react to MPs who rebel against their party. Another new source of data is network analysis. So for example, to examine who works with whom on legislation. And are they likely to, for example, are women allowed to work with other women across party lines to try to pursue women's interests legislation, or are they likely to be punished for reaching across the aisle? There is more now work looking at legislatures in authoritarian systems or in semi-democracies, but I think there is very much not enough of that kind of research. So I think there have been a lot of really felicitous developments in legislative studies, parliamentary studies in the more recent period. But I think we still work too much in our silos. There's too much isolationism within the presidential systems field or the parliamentary systems field. And I think if we look at our work more on a topical basis than a regional or type of system basis, that could facilitate building bridges and take theory development to the next level. So what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about is basically what I would call my wish list for the future. And I think I was gratified yesterday when I was reading the results of your survey because at least I think I'm not going to irritate everybody who's here, because I think some people are thinking along some of these lines. So on my wish list, one of the items that's very important to me and rather self-serving given my research interests, of course, is that I think we need to look more at what groups, what types of people beyond political parties get seats in and also representation in legislatures. As we all know, the world is roiling from insufficient representation of historically underrepresented groups, women, race, ethnic minorities, other minority groups, and lack of representation is threatening the legitimacy of democratic regimes. Just two very loud examples, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, are big examples that have gained global traction even during a pandemic. And certainly the whole problem isn't focused in the legislature, but I think it definitely is a component. Diversity in the social class background of MPs should also impact people's sense of representation, and that topic isn't studied very much. When, where, under what types of institutional designs is the diversity of MPs increasing, both in terms of the numbers of more diverse MPs, but also their access to positions of power within the legislature or the cabinet or top bureaucratic posts, such that they can really produce representation? Legislatures and cabinets are often described as race-gendered institutions. How do race-gendered institutions operate? Some of that description Shane was talking about would be very helpful here. How does that affect policy representation? And I think legislative studies would benefit from including gender, race, class as more than just control variables in empirical analysis. We need databases of parliamentary membership and re-election rates, committee assignments, leadership positions, and we need those data by party. Similar to what Emma said about the need for plurality in the ethnography of legislatures. So we can address questions like, for example, do the work decisions of women in minority legislators differ? Or does party and following the party line override other incentives for work choices? Is the price for moving up the party power ladder conforming to the norms of traditional white male party leaders? And as a side benefit, I think if we incorporate these questions more into legislative studies work, we will enhance the diversity of our field, which, as my colleagues on this day's panel, and certainly Caroline in her very useful presentation, indicate we need to do. A more general question that also relates to the capacity or limits on new types of MPs, cabinet ministers, parties, is how far those new types of representatives can push policy change before those who have traditionally held power utilize chamber rules and other measures to stop policy change. Certainly no president or prime minister is likely to be able to do everything he or she campaigned on, but our new types of presidents, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, or MPs, challenged with greater vigor by the legislature, more aggressive questions, more likely to be sanctioned, greater use of delaying tactics. Republican Representative John Boehner, when his party was campaigning to retake the majority in the US House, which would have made him speaker, was quoted as saying about President Obama's agenda that we're going to do everything, and I mean everything we can, to kill it, stop it, slow it down, whatever we can. And Senate Minority, at that time, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said a very similar thing. Yes, President Obama was from the opposition party with a major reform agenda, but was it also because he was viewed as more threatening because he was the first African-American president? How are women prime ministers and presidents treated? How are women and race ethnic minority cabinet ministers treated by the legislature when they're summoned to testify or to answer parliamentary questions? A different topic on my wish list is that we break down the parliamentary presidential system's divide. I think we should think seriously about when we can use literature and cases from both presidential and parliamentary systems, and also hybrid systems. One topic that's possible is committees. Another is coalitions and how do they impact executive legislative relations. And for example, when are opposition members actually able to work as legislators and representatives versus when are they in the desert, unable to do much of the work that constituents and interest groups actually expect of their elected officials? In presidential systems, in parliamentary systems, we know that most legislative initiatives that are big come out of the executive. In presidential systems, we know that most legislation that passes into law comes out of the executive, yet some backbenchers still propose bills, and those are not always limited to local topics. Who are these legislators, and what are their goals? Are they really just Don Quixotes tilting at windmills, or do they actually have an ability to push policy making, to amend bills proposed by the stronger executive? So the broader question is, do system level differences in institutional design separate parliamentary and presidential cases too much for fruitful comparison? Or might it be differences in level of economic development of the country, or the percentage of the population who lives in poverty and is susceptible to clientelistic vote buying tactics, or how stable democratic rules of the game are, that are the big dividers? A third topic on my wish list is to increase study of the policy implications of how legislatures work. The internal workings of legislatures are, of course, fantastically wonderful questions for those of us who study legislatures. But I think looking at how those internal design questions and the incentives for legislators and parties, how they affect the ability of governments to enact spending, provide welfare benefits, to handle immediate crises like COVID, or longer term crises like environmental change, climate change, are very important. Trying to move along a little bit faster, a fourth topic I think that we need to think about is change points in how legislatures function. I've long envied US Congress scholars and British Parliament scholars for their incredibly long time stream of data. And nowadays in Latin America, we're starting to have a longer time stream of data, which is super cool. But can we just blithely merge all of those years together? I suspect the answer is that it would be dangerous. The early years, at least, when democracy was still a very uncertain thing, behaviors might very well have been different. Parties were worried about taking steps that would bring the military back in. Politicians had to learn that they could build a career even if their party lost an election. Another possible change point could come from party system change. For example, when Costa Rica moved from a stable two-party system to now having an effective number of parties of over 5, it took several administrations for a president to figure out they needed a coalition cabinet. And that's in a long-term stable democracy. Another possible change point could be when a country dramatically changes its electoral rules, as when New Zealand moved from SMD to mixed member. And once again, while working on this talk, I was struck by the limited number of countries that we regularly study as legislative scholars. And I can save a little time because Caroline clearly showed us that, and my colleagues have talked about that already. As somebody who studies a tinier country than Ireland, I've done a lot of work on Honduras, and I am very aware of the challenges of presenting work on a little known case, but I think it's important because it allows us to really take advantage of all the variance that we have across countries. And it also will help us to avoid running the risk, as Palanza, Scarscatini, and Tomasi talk about in their work on institutional legislatures, of building comparative implications from an excessive focus on one particular case. So I think there's a lot of exciting new challenges in parliamentary studies, legislative studies, that will increase the policy relevance of what we do, and also our ability now to answer new questions. And in that sense, I think it will be exciting for my successors as editors at LSQ to be seeing the kind of work that's coming in. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.